It's nice to be back in the city of angels and looking around this group. I don't see a single Halloween witch. Thank God. I guess I'll have to wait until tomorrow. The World Affairs Council is my host, and the chairman, as you heard, is a fellow Laurentian. And the first thing he said to me when we shook hands, he said, "Go Lawrenceville." So I thank you for inviting me to speak to this uniquely remarkable audience that are interested in promoting U.S.-Arab relations. My good friend, Dr. Ray Irani, is the one who instigated this adventure. Without him, I would still be in Washington, D.C. at Georgetown University, which is not known for angel-type characters. Saudi Arabia, ladies and gentlemen, is celebrating its 84th birthday this year. Since its establishment, when the union between the Sultanate of Najd and its dependencies joined the Kingdom of the Hijaz to become the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, many so-called experts and pundits predicted its imminent downfall. But as you can see, their prophetic capabilities have proved to be short of the mark, thank God. As we are witnessing today, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Qatar, and Jordan joined the United States in striking terrorist targets in Syria. The kingdom has been calling for cooperation against these terrorists since they first appeared in Syria 3 years ago. Then they were few, and the predominant resistance group opposing the murderous regime of Bashar al-Assad were the nationalist, moderate, and inclusive opposition, composed of all the various components of Syrian society. I remind you, ladies and gentlemen, of what I stated to American audiences since September 2011. I said, in Syria, a society now sits on the edge of an abyss of nightmarish internecine warfare which could spill into Lebanon, Turkey, and Iraq. I went on to say, finally, when it comes to difficulties facing our region, one must still admit that terrorism remains an important threat. But it is not just Al-Qaeda that continues to plot against us. There are also various emerging and re-emerging non-state actors who are moving in to take advantage of power vacuums created by shifting political dynamics. With governance in Libya, Yemen, Tunis, Egypt, and Syria in such tenuous conditions, the perfect conditions for terrorist cells to take root and conduct desperate, evil, and anarchical acts are created. In October of the same year, addressing the National Council of U.S. Arab Affairs, I said, in Syria, we see a situation where the bloodshed still continues. And in spite of the efforts, whether by individual leaders like King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia, or the Arab League, or the international community, nonetheless, the government of Syria seems to be bent on continuing its merciless and bloody attack on its people. In November of that year, addressing your sister organization, the World Affairs Council in Washington, I said, the Middle East has entered a phase of profound transition, with governments crumbling, new social forces emerging, partnerships realigning, and international tensions, some quite old, some fairly recent, mounting and requiring reassessments from all policy angles. In April in 2013, at Harvard's Kennedy School, I said, we will continue to do all we can by ourselves and through the Arab League and the United Nations to bring stability to Syria by acting on our principles, which are peace, cooperation, and progress. Along with diplomacy, there must be a level playing field between the combatants on the ground. Bashar's military superiority is what is prolonging the conflict. Supplying the defensive weapons needed by the Syrian people to defend themselves is what will bring about the political settlement. By now, we all know who are the good guys from the bad ones, and supplying them with the weaponry will raise their prestige and give them credence with their people. Dilly-dallying is what allowed Jabhat al-Nusra and other extremists to enter the fray, not the will or the wish of the Syrian people. And in October of that year as well, again at the National Council of U.S.-Arab Relations, I said, if the world, and especially the American people, believe that removing Assad's chemical weapons will end his slaughter of innocent children, women, and men in Syria, then all semblance of rational thought, humanitarian care, and national self-interest are thrown to the wind. Preventing Assad from using his killing machine by any means, including targeted strikes at his air force and command and control centers, is the only way that a politically negotiated end to the carnage in Syria can be achieved. You delay that now, and you will have to do more when the carnage spreads to Lebanon, Israel, Jordan, Turkey, and Iraq. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm not touting my prophetic capabilities. I am reflecting on what could have been. Had America and Europe listened to the kingdom and provided the moderate opposition with anti-tank, anti-aircraft, and anti-artillery weapons at the start of the Syrian people's uprising against the barbarous and bloodthirsty Assad regime, we would not have had to deploy our air forces to face the challenge of Daesh, as it is called by some in the Arab world, and ISIL, as your president calls it. I call it fahish, which in Arabic means the worst of the worst. These terrorists filled the void because of this neglect of the genuine opposition. And while Assad continued to bomb and gas his people, the moderate opposition had to fight on two fronts. Assad on one front, and Fahish and its fellow terrorists on the other. But this is not the time to say, we told you so. It is the time to go forward and build on the present military action with a political program to pacify and defuse the many hotspots in the Middle East. We can't just hit Fahish and not look to Iraq and help the Iraqi people reach stability. The two situations in Iraq and Syria are connected. Fahish operates in both. Another similarity was that in Iraq, the former Prime Minister, Maliki, who had enjoyed the support of both the United States and Iran, was the cause of the downfall of the Iraqi army because he marginalized and oppressed the Sunni minority in Iraq, driving them to lend support to Fahish when it appeared on their doorstep. In Syria, Bashar al-Assad has been brutalizing the Sunni majority for years. Iran and Russia are his main supporters. Without support of the world community to the moderate opposition, the terrorists filled the void. In Iraq now, the removal of Maliki is helping in stopping the Sunnis from giving support to the terrorists and in forming an inclusive government. Likewise in Syria, ladies and gentlemen. By removing Assad, the Syrian people will be able to form a unity government that will face the terrorists. The Syrian Coalition Council, which is recognized by the United States and the Arab League and major European countries as the legitimate representative of the Syrian people, has declared that it wants to form a national reconciliation government that includes the present regime, but without those who have bloodied their hands with the people's blood. That is the only way that stability will come to Syria. I propose, ladies and gentlemen, that a no-fly zone along the borders of Syria with Jordan and Turkey be declared, and the Coalition Council should be helped in setting up their government on Syrian soil. This will truly legitimize the Council and allow it to treat directly with the Syrian people whom it represents. We turn to Egypt, ladies and gentlemen. President Sisi, having been elected by the people under a constitution that guarantees the protection of religious minorities, is working hard to fix the much abused economy by taking the difficult decisions that affect the lives of all Egyptians, like the removal of government subsidies. Because the people recognize the necessity of such a move, his popularity rating has not suffered. The kingdom stood and will continue to stand with the people of Egypt and provide whatever support it can give. The US and Europe should be equally supportive. But Egypt is equally plagued by an offshoot of Fahish in the Sinai Peninsula. The connection with Syria and Iraq is there. In Yemen, the interim government is in the middle of a struggle with a Shia militia, which is very much modeled on Hezbollah in Lebanon, and has occupied the capital, Sana'a, and other Yemeni cities. Iran is its backer. Working with the United Nations and the US, the Gulf Cooperation Council, led by Saudi Arabia, has helped Yemen to form the now beleaguered interim government. We continue to support it, and yet the US and Europe are paying scant attention to the situation there. Al-Qaeda, the mother of Fahish, is terrorizing the Yemeni people, and some splinter groups have left the mother and declared their allegiance to Fahish. In Bahrain, the kingdom continues to support the efforts of the government to achieve a political reconciliation with the opposition based on the recommendations of the independent commission which investigated the clashes that took place in 2011. The Crown Prince of Bahrain made extensive proposals to move the negotiations forward. Alas, the opposition is boycotting the elections and refuses to negotiate except on its terms. This will further alienate them not only from their fellow Bahrainis who are voting, but also from the growing number of Shia who want a return to normalcy and stability. The Shia who oppose the tiny group that is dictating their terms are growing and will eventually come out in revolt against the extremists. The opposition in Bahrain is also supported by Iran. Bahrain has been free of Fahish and Fahish-like groups. But terrorists from the Shia community continue to inflict harm and bloodshed. You will have noticed, ladies and gentlemen, that I mentioned Iran in several instances. That is because it is intervening in the internal affairs of Syria by sending the Lebanese Hezbollah, along with several Iraqi militias, into Syria to support Assad in killing his people. Even now, Iran has publicly opposed the actions taken against Fahish as an infringement on Syria's sovereignty. And yet, Iran itself has been infringing on the Syrian people's lives by deploying its Revolutionary Guard in battle formations to help Assad kill his people. In Iraq, we saw how Iran continued to cling to and support Maliki, even as he continued to undermine the effectiveness of the Iraqi army by appointing loyal Shia commanders in place of the American-trained and better qualified officer corps. The result was the shameful flight of these Maliki commanders when Fahish attacked Mosul. Now, even as the new Iraqi government is cooperating with the US to drive Fahish from Iraq, Iran's supreme leader opposes the American support for the government. I have already mentioned Iran's support for the Houthis in Yemen, which support is undermining the stability and unity of Yemen, as is also Iran's support for the Wifaq party in Bahrain. In Palestine, Iran's support not only for Hamas, but for the more extreme elements has been the main spoiler of the successive ceasefires agreed to by Hamas and Israel. Last September, at the United Nations General Assembly meeting in New York, our foreign minister met with his Iranian counterpart, and they exchanged lists of complaints about each other's conduct, with the hope that both countries can overcome the suspicion and wariness that separate them. But as long as Iran continues interfering in Arab affairs, relations will remain strained and belligerent. Two things should bring us and the Iranians together: geography and Islam. We lived next to each other for millennia, and whether Sunni or Shi'i, we worship one God, we share the same holy book, the Quran, and we follow the teachings of the same Prophet, Muhammad, peace be upon him. And my hope is that that will bear out more than the differences. Thank you. The need, ladies and gentlemen, to resolve the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is plain to see for any reasonable party in the dispute, except for these Iranian-supported groups on the Palestinian side and the Israeli government and the settlement movement in Israel. The fact that all of the extremist terrorist groups operating in all these Arab countries use the plight of the Palestinian people under Israeli occupation to justify their terrorist activity should convince even the die-hard supporters of Mr. Netanyahu that as long as Israel oppresses the Palestinian people and denies them the right to a nation and an identity, we will continue to see the rise of terrorist groups, even as we work to destroy Fahish. We also have to counter the nihilist ideology that these groups advocate by challenging that ideology and exposing them as subverters of Islam, not Muslims. The Saudi leadership has continually and frequently condemned them, and our religious authorities have been in the forefront of issuing fatwas declaring them as apostates and criminals. Our school curricula have been cleansed of any possible misinterpretations that could lead to extremist views. And our media outlets, even in cyberspace, challenge the misuse and abuse of that new medium by these groups. This new coalition that is now fighting in Syria is using airstrikes, but that is not enough. The ideology must be challenged. The finances must be interdicted. And the cynical supporters of governments that murder their people must be stopped. And for once and for all, I say to those who accuse Saudi Arabia or Saudi sheikhs of supporting ISIS or any other terrorist group to either put up or shut up. Since September 11th, 2001, the Kingdom has worked closely with the United States, the European Union, the United Nations, and other countries to identify the miscreants. Those who have been identified have been prosecuted and convicted. So you can't point your fingers and not come through with what you know. Tell us and we take action. And if there is anyone in this hall or in any other location with names, come forward and deliver what you have. But do not wag your fingers at us. Until today, ladies and gentlemen, the International Center, Counter-Terrorism Center at the United Nations, which the Kingdom first proposed back in 2005 and has been financing with millions of dollars, has done nothing to fulfill its goals. It should be sharing intelligence from the whole world on terrorists and their whereabouts. It should be sharing know-how and expertise with countries that lack both. It should be financing countries that don't have financial resources to beef up their counter-terrorism methods. On all these counts, it fails the test. All of the countries with the wherewithal to continue to contribute to these aims are sitting back and ignoring it. If we had that center operating since 2005, ISIS and similar groups would not have been created. On that somber note, ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for listening to me and wish you well. Thank you. Thank you.
We have time, I think, for some questions.
Yes.
Okay, we have a microphone here. If you can put up your hand.
Raise your hand.
And Alexander will bring the microphone to you.
Please make any question. Good evening, Prince Turki. You spoke a lot about Iran and its ambitions, both regionally and globally. Can you speak a little bit more detail about Iran's nuclear ambitions and the state of its economy and the price of oil, and how you see maybe either of these being related, and what your view is as to how they should be dealt with in the most judicious manner?
I'm not an oil expert, and we have the top oil expert here, Dr. Irani. Perhaps he should be given the microphone to answer you. But I do read the papers. And in all these papers, there have been so many differing opinions as to the cause and the effect of the decline in oil prices. The recent reporting that I heard at various conferences and so on is that simply there is too much oil production in the market. And inevitably that brings down the price. along with that, a country like Saudi Arabia, which for many years has been the leading purveyor and supporter of stability in the oil market prices, also has a responsibility not only to its people, but to its customers, to continue supplying them with oil. And those who have called for Saudi Arabia to cut production, I think do not understand or simply ignore that if Saudi Arabia were to do that, there are other people who will simply take the place of Saudi Arabia and supply. So it's a complicated issue, and I think more expert people could perhaps give you a better answer than I can. But this is what I understood basically from what I've read and listened to from experts. On Iran's nuclear factor, the kingdom, along with the Arab countries in the Arab League, have always been supportive of establishing a zone free of weapons of mass destruction. And not only as a country, but I think as a people, we think that that is the most efficient and the most specific way of preventing proliferation in our part of the world. And in 2010, at the United Nations Review Conference on the Non-Proliferation Treaty in New York, all the members, signatories to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, including the United States, supported the idea of holding a conference on establishing a zone free of weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East. And that conference was supposed to take place in December of 2012. At the last minute, just 2 weeks or 3 weeks before that, the United States UN member representative declared that there was no ground for belief that that conference could succeed, and therefore it should not be held. Since then, there have been several meetings at the International Agency for Atomic Energy, the IAEA, and other UN affiliates to talk about this situation, but nothing has yet come out of this effort. On the other hand, Iran continued to increase its enrichment capacity in spite of the worldwide sanctions that were imposed on it by the United Nations Security Council, which represented the rest of the world, basically, not just the United States. And when the P5+1 began to discuss with Iran the issue of enrichment and putting more inspections and transparency and hopefully stopping any efforts that might later on come about to develop nuclear weapons, an interim agreement was reached at the beginning of this year. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia at the time, along with other countries in the Arab world, including the GCC, welcomed that interim agreement, but also said that we will wait for the final agreement before we will applaud. And my hunch, if you like, or my expectation is that whatever agreement the P5+1 will reach with Iran on their enrichment program, that the GCC countries will welcome that and will also say that we will seek the same. Hence, if there is agreement on a certain level of enrichment, all of the GCC countries, I think, will want to be able to have that kind of development for their nuclear energy, because all of them have ambitions to develop nuclear energy, not only as an alternative to oil and gas, but also because it is a technology that can bring about vast numbers of jobs to the young people in our part of the world. That is my understanding of the issue of nuclear, Iran, etc.
Your Highness, first I would like to thank you for your courageous stand in regard the Syrian people in too many occasions. My question to you is, the coalition attacks, it's only against ISIS. Why the Saudi Arabia and Turkey doesn't put more pressure on President Obama and his administration to attack Assad regime as well? Because the problem would not be solved by just finishing with ISIS, because obviously ISIS came from Assad regime and Iran as well.
As I mentioned in my presentation, we've been trying for the last 3 years to get not just the United States, but the world community to take on the brutality of the Assad regime. Unfortunately, there has not been a positive response from all the world, not just the United States. With this coalition, the attacks on ISIS will achieve one of the positive factors, which will eliminate an enemy of the moderate opposition that has been fighting ISIS and the other terrorist groups like it, in addition to the fight against Assad. So from that aspect, it's very positive. But as I said, that is not the disease. That is the symptom of the disease. The disease is in Damascus. And in order for us not to have more ISISes coming up in the future, we have to eliminate the disease at its root. I remember attending a conference a few weeks back in Aspen, Colorado, where such a discussion was being held, and somebody stood up and said, well, we have to deal with Assad. He's shown that he's a survivor, and he must be considered as a factor in the future relationship with Syria. The former Foreign Minister of the United Kingdom was present, David Miliband, and he stood up after that and he said, you know, Assad is the main recruiting factor for all these terrorist groups. So if you deal with him, you're going to create even more terrorist groups. And I think that's the only way that we can do with that. Pressure on President Obama, I'm sure that our king and our foreign minister with the US Secretary of State and other officials are continuing to urge action against Assad. Whether that will succeed, I don't know. But it is not something that has stopped or is going to stop in our continuing effort to get a worldwide agreement that, as we agreed on the removal of Maliki in Baghdad in order to be able to form a coalition government that can meet the challenge of these groups, also I think in Syria we need to do the same.
Thank you, Your Highness. Would it be fair to say that sending troops or airstrikes is not necessarily a panacea for the region, because as the early suppliers of weapons learned, a lot of those weapons were taken from the moderates by the extremists, including al-Nusra and ISIL. In addition, there was a lot of infighting, and in fact, among the coalition partners, they were fighting each other. And it's also been seen that each airstrike brings new recruits to ISIL. So wouldn't it be fair to say that it's not necessarily, it's much more complicated than that, and just simply supplying people with weapons and training is not a panacea for the, or a solution?
If you'll notice in my presentation, I was referring to situations 3 years ago when the uprising against Assad began. And at the very beginning, of course, it was a very peaceful and very much non-military uprising against Assad. Assad, having taken the decision to turn it into a battle for his survival, made it into a military confrontation. At that time, the crux, if you like, or the majority of the opposition was coalescing around the Free Syrian Army. Before ISIS, before Jabhat al-Nusra, before any of these groups came in. And it was at that time, I think, that the world community should have been forthcoming in supplying the opposition with the anti-tank, anti-aircraft, and anti-artillery weapons that were needed to neutralize Assad's superiority. Having failed to do that, without any question, there was, if you like, an abatement of the enthusiasm for the Free Syrian Army and the influx of these more terroristic and more bloodthirsty groups to come in and take the lead from the Free Syrian Army. In that scenario, I would propose to you that, yes, some of the Free Syrian Army people went over to ISIS and to Jabhat al-Nusra. Some simply went back home, if you like, to their villages and stayed with their families. But there has remained a core of that Free Syrian Army, and we read about it every day in the newspapers and see it on television, that continues to fight not only Assad and his aircraft and artillery and tanks, but also Jabhat al-Nusra and ISIS. And it is this core group that I'm sure now is being not only trained, but also hopefully will be supplied with the means to defend themselves against Assad's artillery, aircraft, and missiles. Once they can do that and show to the Syrian people that they have neutralized Assad's capabilities, more and more people will coalesce around them. And I think that is the only viable alternative to the present status quo. In addition to that, what I'm proposing is that the no-fly zones along the borders between Turkey and Syria and Jordan and Syria will be able to provide the coalition council, which is now based in Istanbul, to come to Syrian soil and establish its government and have immediate contact with the Syrian people. That will show that there is seriousness, not only in the world community to do that, but also among these Syrian opposition groups who are now simply living in Istanbul and in other capitals and not being able to go home. So I think the two can go together if we are serious about it. And that I see no other alternative to that except for continued fighting.
Your Highness, thank you for being with us. As you well know, Israel considers a nuclear Iran to be an existential threat to its survival. Number one, does Saudi Arabia have the same feeling? And if so, do you foresee an alliance between Saudi Arabia and Israel to eliminate the nuclear threat of Iran?
I hear that question often, sir, and I think there is an important element here that that question raises, which is Israel has ignored, if not outright refused, all the peace proposals that have come particularly from Saudi Arabia. In 1981-82, at the height of Israel's invasion of Lebanon in those days, the late King Fahd made his famous Fahd peace plan, made up of 8 points in which for the first time he called on the Arab world to recognize the existence of Israel and to achieve peace with Israel, and of course, the establishment of a Palestinian state. That proposal was ignored. No comment, no response, no acceptance, not even rejection by Israel. And 20 years later, King Abdullah, as Crown Prince, made his famous Arab Peace Initiative proposal of Israeli withdrawal from occupied territories, including Jerusalem, in return for Arab recognition, end of hostilities, and trade, etc., and hopefully the resolution of the refugee problem through negotiation between the Palestinians and the Israelis. Again, there was absolutely no positive engagement with that by any Israeli official other than President Perez. I must give him credit. He said there are some elements in that proposal that maybe Israel can work with. And that was it. Netanyahu, Olmert, Zipi Livni, you name them, any of the Barak, all of them have simply ignored the Arab Peace Initiative which was proposed by Saudi Arabia. Regardless of whether Iran's nuclear threat is a reason for Israel and Saudi Arabia to come together, I think the Israelis have a duty to their own people, let alone to us as Arabs, to come clean on what they think about the Arab Peace Initiative. After all, this is what Israel has been calling for since its establishment, that they have peace, that they have normal relations, that they are accepted in the area, etc., etc. So I can't foresee any linkage, whether overt or covert, between Saudi Arabia and Israel when it comes to dealing with the issue of Iran's nuclear developments. And as I said in my previous answer, the establishment of a zone free of weapons of mass destruction in the area will go in a better way, in my view, in eliminating any reason for proliferation of nuclear weaponry in our part of the world.
We have time for one more question.
Thank you very much.
Assalamu alaikum. I'm right here. Right. My name is Annie Zonneveld. I'm president and founder of Muslims for Progressive Values. We have been talking a lot about war and strategies. I really want to focus the shift to peace. Is it possible that for you and the leadership in Iran, the Saudi Arabian leadership, to sit down and figure out a peace treaty between the two, because the mayhem that has been caused in the Muslim countries is intolerable? Number two, is it possible for Saudi Arabia to take the lead? I know we don't have a pope, but if Saudi Arabia, as the caretaker of Mecca, whatever you do plays an important role towards all of us Muslims here, especially in the West, in the anti-Islam sentiment, can you tamper down, can you influence the Muslim majority countries, for example, to have better governance? Because you mentioned about Iraq and how ISIS had its appeal because of the prosecution of the Sunnis. So a lot of the mayhem in the Muslim world is because of poor governance. Can you, as Saudi Arabia, shift the thinking, shift the discussion to better governance, for democracy, for human rights for all?
You'll have to. The first question was whether Saudi Arabia and Iran would find some way of talking about peace together. Yeah. The second question was to what extent could Saudi help to improve governance in the direct words that I got from your question before it was explained to me by Mr. McCarthy was that we have no pope in the Muslim world. But as I mentioned in my presentation, yani, there are attempts between Saudi Arabia and Iran to try to reach some kind of understanding, if not go beyond that into better relations. You know, in the past 20 years, there have been such attempts which succeeded up to a time when the former Iranian President Rafsanjani was in power in the 90s. Actually, that's when President King Abdullah, who was then Crown Prince, engaged with Rafsanjani in trying to open up relations in a better way between us after the death of Khomeini. And that went some way. When Rafsanjani was succeeded by Khatami, those relations improved dramatically, and to the extent where we had President Khatami on an official visit to the kingdom. He toured the kingdom and so on. And we actually signed a security pact with Iran, signed by the present president of Iran, Mr. Rouhani, who was then the national security advisor to Khatami. As I said, the change in Iranian policy by increasing, if not downright invading Arab countries, that is what is really disturbing for us in Saudi Arabia, and not just in Saudi Arabia, but in all the area. And if the Iranians want us to improve our relationship, I think they have to remove their interference from Arab countries. And this is what is being talked about in the lists that I told you having been exchanged between the two countries. So there is no reluctance on the part of Saudi Arabia to improve relations with Iran, but we need to see specific and verifiable action by Iran that it too wants to improve those relations by its conduct, not by its words. So it's very important that they do that. The kingdom has a responsibility to the Muslim world. There is no denying that. We are the country where the Holy Prophet was born, where the Quran was revealed to the Prophet, where Mecca and Medina exist today. Just at the beginning of this month, October, there were more than 3 million pilgrims in the holy towns of Mecca and Medina in Saudi Arabia. And indeed, Saudi Arabia feels a responsibility to all these people. And we try, first of all, to improve ourselves in order for us to be able to tell others to do that. So in terms of human rights, in terms of governance, in terms of other reforms that we have undertaken, we have done some steps that we think will lead to even more steps. Question coming from a lady, I would say that in the past 3 years, the kingdom enfranchised women not only to vote in Saudi elections, but also to be candidates for office in those elections. Subsequent to that decision, the king appointed to the consultative assembly, which we have, 30 ladies, making the number in percentage-wise 20% of our consultative assembly. And I think that stands in good comparison to other assemblies in the world, including the United States Congress. Equally, job opportunities for women have been opened completely, and the government took the lead in not only promoting this idea, but also in preventing whoever wanted to prevent this from taking action and doing that. We still have a long way to go. And one of the improvements, I think, in our conduct vis-a-vis issues of human rights and other issues like that, is that within the government, there is a Human Rights Commission that deals with complaints that come about government action and or lack of action towards that matter. And one of the important activities of this Human Rights Commission is that it connects with worldwide organizations that deal with similar issues in order to learn from them how they operate on these issues. So yes, we have a responsibility to the Muslim world, but I don't think we can preach to others before we can do ourselves what we preach. And I must admit, as a developing nation, as a young nation, as a nation with many social and historic and cultural issues to deal with, we have taken steps. It will still take us some time, and until that time comes, perhaps not in my lifetime, but I hope soon enough, that then we will be able to go forward and tell others how they should act. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. You've been very generous and very gracious. Thank you. Thank you very much. Take this with me, or? Thank you, Mr. Mustafa.